Hello and welcome to New Books in History, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm Joshua and I'll be your host today. Today we'll be talking to Jered Rubin about his book Rulers, Religion and Riches, Why the West Got Rich and the Middle East Did Not. Jered is a professor at the Ardress School of Business and Economics and the co-director of the Institute for the Study of Religion, Economics and Society at Chapman University. His book, Rulers, Religion and Riches, was published in 2017 and has been awarded the Lyndon Williamson Prize by the Economic History Association and the Douglas North Best Book Award by the Society of Institutional and Organizational Economics. It has been translated into Urdu and is currently being adapted into Arabic. We've got lots to talk about today, only so much time, so we ought to get started. Jered, welcome to New Books in History.
Thank you very much for having me, Josh. Looking forward to this.
Thank you. Perhaps we could start by talking a little about yourself and your journey in academia. What got you interested in economics and economic history?
Question. So it started with my first semester, my very first year of undergraduate. I took an undergraduate course in economics. I had no idea I wanted to do anything like that. I thought I was going to be a mathematician. I went to the University of Virginia, and there's this course that almost everybody there takes by Professor Ken Elzinga. And it's just an amazing course. And I knew after that semester that that's what I wanted to do with my life. It just so happened I wanted to be a math major anyway. And those two things go kind of hand in hand when both applying for grad school and in economics, at least, but also succeeding in grad school. I had no idea I wanted to do economic history, though. In fact, I thought I wanted to be a macroeconomist when I got to grad school. That lasted for about 3 weeks in grad school, and I realized what graduate macroeconomics was like. And really, by the end of my first year of grad school, for listeners out there that don't know this, the first year of economics grad school is quite hard. It's quite dispiriting. Depending on where you go, I think this is true of most places I know of. And I was about to drop out. So in my second year, I went to Stanford for graduate school. We had to generally take 2 years if you wanted to kind of leave with a master's. So my first semester or my first quarter, my second year, I took a class with Avner Greif, so well-known economic historian. I didn't really know of him at the time, and I certainly didn't go to Stanford to study with him or because of him. I had never heard of him, but when I went there, and I had only vaguely heard of him when I got there. Mm-hmm. And I took this class on, it was on institutions. And so he was writing his book at the time. His book came out in 2006, Institutions and the Path to the Modern Economy, which one of the groundbreaking books in institutional analysis and economic history. And the class just blew me away that economists could do this. Because I was also, as an undergraduate, I was interested in religion as well. I minored in religion only because really they wouldn't allow me to triple major. And I thought it was just something I'd kind of read on the side. This is just something, it's not something that it's any personal conviction of mine that has gotten me interested in religion. Not that I think it really matters for academic study, but I'm an a-religious person myself. But I've always been fascinated by religion. Actually, it's in part because I think I'm a-religious. I understand the impact that it has on people, the effect that it has on people, even from a microeconomic perspective, the way it incentivizes people to do certain types of actions. And I just didn't get it because it didn't affect me in that way. So it was something I wanted to know more about. And I thought forever would be something that I just studied on the side or read on the side, as I'm going to sleep or something. And then this class completely blew me away because one thing that Greif studies is the differences in the Christian world and the Islamic world and the role that both kind of cultural values as well as religious values have played in shaping long-run economic development and long-run institutional development. And probably within a month of starting that class, I went to him with a ton of ideas that I wanted to work on. And he graciously took me on as his student, even though those ideas were all very, very half-baked. I think that's the way a lot of graduate students' ideas are at the beginning, at least. And from there, I knew that this was something that I could spend the rest of my life doing. And so from there, I've spent more or less most of my career, including in grad school. So, pushing on 15, even closer to 20 years now, working on kind of this nexus between economic history, religion, institutions, and even culture, more broadly defined, not always religion. And really what I originally focus on and still do focus on is these differences between Christianized Western Europe and historical Christianized Western Europe and the historical Middle East, Muslim Middle East. In part, there's a lot of reasons for this. In part is because I kind of initially knew quite a bit about Islam. So this was something I already had some fascination with. It's also because there's natural reasons, I think, to be interested in the two. There's so much historic overlap between the Middle East, the Muslim world, for maybe lack of a better term, and the Christian West, both through trade, through just geographic proximity. And we also know that the Middle East, the Muslim world more generally, was well ahead of Europe for so long. Economically after the spread of Islam, and then at some point there was a reversal of fortunes, and these were the types of things that had always fascinated me, and I kind of realized at that stage in graduate school that these were the types of questions that maybe if I could even have a small slice of an answer into that, it would make from my own perspective, a very satisfying career, but also just for an interesting life, I think, too. I think if anyone can find questions they're passionate about and really just want to know the answer to, but also have in some way, shape, or form, both the capacity to answer them, but also, one thing I was hoping to do, and I was fortunate enough to do, is, be paid to answer these, in the sense that, I'm a professor and the research part of my job is to do precisely this. It would lead to an amazing life. And I was also extremely fortunate that my third year at Stanford, we had a visitor for the year, Timur Karan, who also very graciously took me on as one of his students. So they were both my two advisors. And he was, at the time, was a professor at University of Southern California. Now he's at Duke. And he's he is the world's leading expert on the economic history of Middle East and Islam. And since then, both Avner and Timur and I both myself and Avner and myself and Timur have worked on projects. They've just been sources of inspiration in many, many different ways and really, so, I mean, this kind of shows, I think this story also shows the role that luck plays. If I had gone to more or less, I think, almost any of the other graduate schools I'd gotten into, my life would be very different. And I would certainly not have written the book that I wrote or have studied what I did. I just so happened to be in the right place at the right time for doing exactly what I ended up doing.
Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful story, and very, as you acknowledge, very much a serendipitous story.
Absolutely.
I'm curious because you're not just an economist, you're also, as I think you've proven with this book and your attendance on this program, a historian. Yeah. So how does history inform the way you think and work as an economist?
Yeah, so history in itself is, so some economic historians, I think, view history as a testing ground for their theories. I don't view it that way. I view history as something that we can gain some insight into, both for our own just intellectual curiosity, but also because it helps inform a whole host of things that we care a lot about today. Namely, the thing that I care about the most in terms of this line of research specifically, but more generally as well, is why some parts of the world are wealthy and others remain at least not wealthy. Maybe poor might be too strong a word, but that's an important question that I'm hardly the only person to ask. This is one of the oldest and most important questions in the social sciences, but it's also inherently a historical question. Even though there are certainly economists as well as other social scientists that attempt to answer such questions ahistorically, thinking about more modern relative prices or patterns of trade, things like this, and these are not necessarily unimportant. They do, I think, at least explain kind of the proximate causes, but they don't explain the deeper causes. And this is one of the things that has always interested me. Again, I wasn't planning on studying these things, but as soon as I understood that I could study religion and study the history of religion too, because it's for me, it's also really hard to study religion without studying history. I think the two go hand in hand. There's so much important there's so much to both modern religion as well as historical religion that's built into history that all of these things, I think, kind of mesh together into one. Economics being kind of the third leg of these three. And for me, at least, it's very hard to understand any one of these three without the other.
Mm, that's very true. Now, let's move on to the book itself.
Sure.
Could you tell us how you came to write this book?
Sure. So the book itself is partially an outgrowth of my PhD dissertation. So my PhD dissertation, what I did there was I tried to think of a kind of a more general theory for how economically inhibitive religious norms kind of persist or don't, because I was interested in that. So I applied it to usury restrictions in Islam and Christianity, taking restrictions on taking interest on loans. And I viewed this as kind of more of like a microcosm for what might be broader institutional differences between, say, Christian polities or Western Christian polities in the late medieval period and Muslim polities over the same period. Namely, because these restrictions on taking interest, they were around in both religions for a very long time. Christianity, well over a millennium. In Islam, formally, they're still around today. Even though, interestingly enough, as I think many people do know, that they're very easy to get around, and they've always been easy to get around. Yet, manifest usury or straight up lending at interest has always been banned. And this was something that fascinated me, not just for the intellectual history of usury restrictions, which there has been done a lot of work on. That's not the type of history I was interested in, especially kind of coming at it from an economics perspective. But really, I should say a political economy perspective, because what I was interested in is what role did political economy play in either keeping these laws to persist or not. And what I came down to in the dissertation and then expanded on in some of my first few papers coming out of it were the role that religious authorities played in legitimating role was really important. And we can think about this. So as an economist, I think about these things maybe or I do in terms of equilibria. Namely, that you might think of there being two different equilibria, one in which religious authorities have a lot of power to legitimate, maybe for historical reasons, one in which they have less power to do so. In the equilibrium where they have a lot of power to legitimate, the types of laws and policies you see are going to be ones that are going to be ones in which religious authorities are at the bargaining table, and this kind of political bargaining table is going to reflect their interests, right? And they're not just their interests, but their bargaining power, which is strong. And over time, you're going to see them continue to be strong because there's little incentive for rulers to take them out of the bargaining table, even if the types of laws and policies they want might be economically inhibitive. So yeah, you might be lowering your tax base, but these guys are keeping you in power. Eventually, whereas so you might think of that, for lack of a better term, as the equilibrium in parts of the Islamic world. Whereas after commerce really started to revive in Europe, and the church started to become a little weaker, they were certainly not as strong at legitimating as Muslim clerics were. At least the stronger Muslim clerics were. You start to see an unraveling of this equilibrium in Europe, and other people, namely, and the important ones become parliaments, are the powerful players in parliaments, become alternative sources of legitimacy. Now, not all of this was in my dissertation. My dissertation essentially did focus on usury restrictions, kind of explaining what they were. There's a lot in my dissertation, which has a lot of unnecessary detail. And actually does form a chapter of this book. I do have a chapter in the book on usury restrictions as kind of an example for the general mechanisms. But what I tried to do more general, and I think the most powerful chapter in the dissertation really tried to get at a theory for why these two diverged. And then from there, I built on this theory. I did some work with some colleagues that used elements of this theory. So two colleagues, Metin Joskal and Thomas Maselli, both at the University of Connecticut, we use kind of similar theories and expanded on the theories too. They were certainly influential in the way I thought about this, to think about why the Ottoman Empire banned the printing press for nearly 250 years after knowing about it. So the Ottomans knew about the printing press in the 1480s, and at least all the documents we have suggest that it was either explicitly or implicitly banned until 1727. We view this as part of the same process. So, namely, where you have religious authorities that have a lot of influence. We call them legitimating agents. They're people in society that, for some reason or another, have the power to legitimate political rule. And because they had so much bargaining power, and because for the specific context of Muslim religious authorities, the printing press was threatening to them. It threatened their monopoly on all things intellectual, particularly all things to do with the religion of Islam. And this proved prescient too. In Europe, the printing press helped spread the seeds of religious dissent. As soon as the printing press eventually spread in the Muslim world in the early 19th century, there were massive calls of reform of the religious establishment. So this was something that they were, from their own self-interested perspective, were probably right to try to block. But again, what we tried to do in those papers, and what I try to also do in the book, is kind of put it in a more general framework for thinking about the political economy of why these types of laws and policies might persist or not. Whereas in Europe, the printing press spread very quickly. Again, even though the church would have been wise to try to block it, as I just mentioned, it was a major instigator of the Protestant Reformation, which essentially undermined the church in large parts of Europe. But the church really didn't have power to do this by the time the printing press was invented in around 1450. They were already kind of out. They already had a much weaker position vis-a-vis secular rule than Muslim religious authorities did. Certainly in the Ottoman Empire, but in large swaths of the Middle East and elsewhere. So I think that's kind of a very long-winded way of describing the initial impetus, but also some of the ideas that originally helped form this book.
No, it's not long-winded at all. I think you've done an excellent job of summarizing a good many years worth of research into just a couple of minutes. So I should point out that, Jered, I think you've spent a good third of your life working on this very question. So every step of this, every piece of the puzzle, you've thought through very methodically and really planned it out very well.
Yeah, so thank you. I appreciate you saying that, because it certainly feels that way. I make a joke about one paper when I used to present the book, that I wrote one paper. It's actually a paper connecting the printing press to the Reformation, and to write it, I started to write it when I realized that it would make the book's arguments much stronger if I could make that connection empirically. So I collected a lot of data on printing presses, a lot of data on which places turned Protestant, a lot of other control data. And my joke was essentially that it was about 2.5 years of my life for 9 pages of the book, which is not factually inaccurate, but it is the type of thing that's the way, especially economists work. I think more so than historians, because history is such a book-driven discipline that I wouldn't have done that for a history book. Namely, I would have gotten a lot more leverage out of it. But in history, but economics is a much more article-driven discipline. So it ended up being about 40% of the book was in some way, shape, or form in an article that was published in an academic journal somewhere. And it wasn't just stapled in the sense that I didn't just take it verbatim and put it in the book. I rewrote nearly the entire article, took large chunks out, placed different chunks in different parts of the book. But still, yes, no, the book that certainly represents. It was published in 2017, and I started on these ideas in 2004. So it represents certainly the lion's share of my academic career, and even a large fraction of my life at this point.
What I really liked about your book is how you chose to frame your argument. You allude, for example, to not just the concept of a great divergence, as most economic historians do, but a great reversal. How this equilibrium that you talk about shifted over time. In what ways does this great reversal paradigm challenge our conventional understanding of the economic history of the world?
Well, I think so. The great reversal, in many ways, and just to be clear, we're talking about the reversal. In my book, I'm talking about the reversal between the broader Middle East and Western Europe, because there were similar reversals, you could say, between Western Europe and China, Western Europe, and South Asia. Yeah, and then saying even 1,000 years ago, all three of those parts of the world were ahead of Western Europe on most things we would think of in terms of economically, technologically, scientifically. And I think these things are in one way are known. I'm by no means the first person to point out that there was a reversal of fortunes between Western Europe and the rest of what we might say Eurasia. Even because even Eastern Europe, which would have been the Byzantine ruled by the Byzantine Empire at this point, was ahead of Western Europe. Say between really the fall of the Western Roman Empire in about 1000 or so. So on the one hand, this reversal of fortune is well known, but on the other hand, many of the leading theories start from the position of after the reversal has already happened. So it's trying to explain European ascendance without necessarily explaining why there was a reversal. Now, on the one hand, you might say that there is a reason for this, in that a lot of what happened, especially with industrialization and the century after, so say the 19th century, it was very much a European takeoff. And it wasn't necessarily the other parts of the world that had at one point been ahead of Europe really falling behind. It was fundamentally European takeoff. So there is some there, and I don't get me wrong, I actually like many of those works that really focus on what was happening in Europe, because you do have to focus, especially maybe even more so on England, or at least Northwestern Europe, say this maybe 17th through 18th and 19th centuries. But there has been much less work done that tries to explain kind of the bigger picture within one framework. So if you want to, in my view, and this is how I frame the book, is if you want to explain what was, why, or if you want an explanation that invokes something, and my explanation is going to invoke religion, but not, and also to be clear, just in case it's not clear, I don't really invoke any aspect of religious doctrine in my explanation, except for the fact that Islam is a bit better for historical reasons at legitimating rule. All other types of doctrine at best play a background role, and for the most part don't play a role at all. But what I do say is that the reason that that this mattered is that the political economy of these two religions and these two worlds, in a sense, were very different. If you want to, but I also say, look, if you want to make an explanation that says that political economy mattered for long run economic or political development, you also have to explain why did the Middle East pull ahead for so long too. And if your explanation is only consistent with Europe pulling ahead, but not the Middle East, or if you're looking at China or South Asia, wherever pulling ahead for so long, I think that your explanation is lacking in something. And that's what my explanation tries to do. And so to give a slightly deeper dive into what the explanation is, at least for the initial part, in terms of what allowed the Middle East to pull ahead, is around the time of the spread of Islam in the 7th century. This is certainly a period where Western Europe's more or less at one of its low points, following the utter decimation of the Western Roman Empire. Political rules really decentralized to the extent that it exists at all. There's large swaths of Europe that are more or less in kind of chaos, constant fighting, very little protection of rights, or not just property rights, but just physical rights.
Mm-hmm.
And to a large extent, this was kind of true in the Arabian Peninsula and surrounding regions where Muhammad was born. And one thing that Islam does is it brings this unifying ideology, and not just ideology, but eventually over the next couple centuries, a political system. It brings in institutions to administer justice, to just administer. Yeah, it brings an administrative capacity through these qadis that end up being spread throughout these Islamic empires. And because of this, this allows for much more trade. It allows for this kind of the reason it allows for trade rather is you have this unifying ideology. You have currencies that become much more widespread. You have a unifying language. You have protections that are offered, and a lot of this has to do with the role that Islam plays in politics. It allows for, in a sense, more powerful rulers to give these protections, and these are the types of protections that would have been extremely useful in Europe in the early medieval period. Now, there were rulers that in theory had purview over a lot of land, like the Frankish kings, like Charlemagne, but they really actually did not have much administrative capacity or the capacity to administer law and order outside of a very narrow set of areas. Whereas this was not necessarily the case in the empires that followed Muhammad, the Umayyad and Abbasid Empire, which had much greater capacity to do this. And part of the argument in the book, and to be fair, this is not, the book doesn't spend a great deal of time on this, but what it does try to do early on is to show that the argument is consistent, though, with the early rise of Islam, and not just Islam, but the early rise of Islamic economies. The argument, though, then says, well, look, it's the having religion and religious authorities play a key role in politics is good is good for economic development when the initial state or the initial conditions are such that of the Arabian Peninsula or Western Europe in the 7th century, relative chaos, highly decentralized, things like that, because of this unifying element. However, it can also lead to an equilibrium, as I call it, where you get stagnation, where now religious leaders have an important seat at the bargaining table. And because of that, so other interests are going to be left out of the bargaining table, namely, and the one I really focus on in the book are economic elites. And this is important not because economic elites have the views of the nation at their heart, or they want everyone to have a fair shake or anything. In fact, it's generally quite the opposite. It's more that their self-interest often is consistent with the types of things that promote trade, promote growth, things like that, because that's what they benefit directly from. And so the argument then says, well, once Europe eventually, very slowly got out of these doldrums, beginning with the commercial revolution, and really the 11th, but really taking off in the 12th and 13th century. It starts in the northern Italian city-states and the Low Countries and spreads to a few other places, mainly in Central Europe. Because you don't have as strong, and of course, the church played a huge role in politics in the medieval period. I'm of course not saying that, but the role it played was still different, and in many ways was antagonistic towards secular rule, which is very different from the Middle East. And because of this, because the rulers in Europe weren't kind of tied to the church as their only source, or not only source, because as a key source of legitimacy, they could look elsewhere. And they did eventually, starting especially in the late medieval period. And that's when they turned to parliaments, which is where the economic elite got a bigger say in state making and the laws and policies of the state. And that's where the argument, I think, and that's where I'd like to think I succeeded, because this is what I've just immersed myself in for so long. But this is at least what I'd like to think of as an argument that can explain both, in a sense, both the initial success of the Muslim world but also it's relative stagnation. And the term relative is really key here because, again, it is eventually Europe that just takes off. It's not necessarily the Middle East that falls well behind in absolute terms.
I think you make a good point that it's very important that we clarify this misconception. Your book, although it's about the relationship between religion and economics, it's not so much about religious doctrine and
Yeah.
theology, so much as it is about how these religious institutions operated within the political economy of that time.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. And this is something that when presenting the book, and even if you read the last chapter of the book, I have this section on misconceptions. The book,
Mm-hmm.
whenever I'd present the book, within 10 minutes, I'd get something along these lines saying, well, how can you say this? This is, this is not about the content of the religion. Why would the content of the religion have such large effects on long run economic outcomes? And my answer was always the same. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying this at all. And so slowly, as I was writing the book, this was actually one of the bigger challenges, was figuring out a way to make it as clear as possible that at least my theory is not based on these doctrinal differences. This is not to say that, I think it's an open question whether doctrinal differences matter. I tend to think they don't, but that's just not what my book is focused on. So that I think is always kind of clear. And when you're dealing, and I've noticed this, with both myself on other works and also colleagues that work in similar fields, when you're dealing with religion in particular, people have, they're very tied to it. They have preconceived notions of what's good, what's not good. And my goal is not necessarily to move them from those notions, but to contextualize it and show that there's nuance. And it's not, and really, it's not even often the religion itself. It's the role that it plays in these larger institutions. And in the case of my book, the political economy institutions of the regions I'm looking at.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to take a step back, and you talk about how pre-modern Middle Eastern economies were more advanced technologically, economically than Western ones. What metrics would economists or historians have used to come to this conclusion?
So this is something that has been kind of largely viewed as the going thing in studies of this period. So economically, for instance, we know that coinage is way more widespread. There's essentially no coinage for a long time in Western Europe. And anytime there was coinage, it was essentially from the Middle East or elsewhere. And that's a big thing. It's highly suggestive of trade. We have travelers' accounts knowing that we have population estimates. So the city of in one of the first few pages of my book, economic historians have tried to go back and estimate populations. These are very fuzzy estimates, but they give you broad ideas of how big urban areas were. And urban areas are probably one of the best ways of correlate or proxying rather for pre-modern economic development, because if you had a large urban area, that meant, well, first off, it meant you had the agricultural surplus to feed these people that were living in the cities and not producing food, but it also meant that you had a large business in luxury goods, because it was more of the luxury goods that were produced and consumed in the cities. And we know with near certainty that the city of Baghdad was way bigger. This was the Abbasid capital, was way bigger, say, in the year 800 than anything in Europe. In fact, the data supplied by other economic historians I know in the book is that Baghdad itself was bigger than the 13 biggest cities of Western Europe combined. And if you look at the top cities of this period, they're all kind of near the Abbasid capital in modern day Iraq, with the exception of Constantinople, which was a Christian city at the time, but a Byzantine city. Western Europe had very small cities, so that would be on the economic side. The evidence is just overwhelming that until the year 1000. The Middle East was fairly far ahead. Where that reversal happens, you could ask 10 different economic historians. They give you 10 different answers, I think.
Mhm.
But I don't think any of them would say that by 1700 the reversal had happened. Now, there are some economic historians that would say that the reversal hadn't happened yet in 1700 between Western Europe and China. Some, like Ken Pomerantz, who coined the term the Great Divergence, puts it more or less after after industrialization. Um, but yeah, there almost all the evidence we have suggests that the Middle East was, especially in its richest parts, was pretty far ahead of Europe. Yeah, and you mentioned, technologically, we know that there's just there for one, there's almost no technology produced in Europe between the fall of the Roman Empire and the year 1000. Now that'll get me in a little trouble. There was technology produced in this period. A lot of it was relatively minor agricultural technology. Some of it war making technology. Very, very little, and I can't think of anything off the top of my head that you would think of as kind of one of the fundamental innovations of the period. Most of them were coming from China, but to the or to some extent South Asia. A lot of it was coming through the Middle East as well. So whether it was invented by Middle Easterners or used by Middle Easterners, I think it's a relatively uncontroversial statement to say that the technology, at the peak of the Abbasid Empire, which was in the ninth, very early 10th century, but early 9th century, was way ahead of contemporary Europe at the time.
Mhm.
And it's really it's a series of metrics. There's no one silver bullet, but everything we know from this period would suggest that.
Mhm. And I think one of the metrics you use in your book that I found particularly interesting was this idea of an urban center of gravity. And I hope I'm explaining it right. It's
Yep.
the weighted average position of the population of a particular region at a given point in time. And over time, we see this urban center of gravity shift quite miraculously away from the Middle East towards northwestern Europe in a leftward, upward sloping trajectory. That's quite interesting and very much telling of the trend that you've observed here, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it was kind of what I did to calculate that was use these same population data we were just discussing, and so there's these three economists, Bosker, Bering, and Van Zanden, who wrote a paper where they've made these data public, where they have population data from 800 through 1800, more or less for all of, you might think of it as Western Eurasia and North Africa. So you might think of it as the middle, or the Western Islamic world and Europe. Um, and so what I did was exactly as you described here, calculated what you can think of as an urban center of gravity. You can think about it as if Iraq is really highly populated in that area, it's going to pull the urban center of gravity to the southeast. If England's really highly populated, it's going to move it towards the northwest. And in a pre-industrial world, as we just discussed, population is one of urban population. It might be the best metric we have. In a post-industrial world, that's a little different, just because we've solved some of the difficulties with with population, with having large populations. So you can have poor cities that are large. That wasn't really the case in the pre-industrial era. And yeah, so as you described it, if you look at in the year 800, 900, it's really pulled towards the southeast into that Abbasid cradle. In fact, the only thing pulling it west is Spain, which is Muslim at the time. The Umayyad Caliphate in Spain is so on mainland Europe. Until the year 1000, really, Spain was by far the leader. It was Muslim Spain was by far the leader on everything we think about, including architecture and centers of learning and things like this. And then that figure in my book, it's also in the first chapter. It's the reason I include it in the book is it's just so striking. It's moving kind of just straight up towards the northwest. Eventually, where eventually the locus of economic activity is, and to be clear, it's not just England. It eventually becomes the Dutch Republic as well, which is kind of one of the first real modern economies based on trade, highly urban. So yeah, it's northwestern Europe that eventually becomes the center, and part of most of the book. The reason that's in chapter one, those figures, is that's the puzzle, is explaining why that center of gravity moves in the way it does.
Hmm. Hmm. And yeah, that's certainly true. I think the podcast medium definitely doesn't do justice to your research and findings in this book, but all the more reason to purchase it.
Thanks.
Um, I'm curious about what you have to say about alternative explanations for this great divergence. You mentioned Ken Pomeranz earlier, but I'm interested in finding out what you think about the broad sweeping narratives of Jared Diamond, the theory of wage differentials favored by Bob Allen,
Yeah,
and this Protestant work ethic. It's quite controversial, the Protestant work ethic
sure,
by Max Weber.
sure. So I guess I take any of those. So or I'll take those in the way you asked them. So Diamond first. Diamond's argument, is mainly based on geography. Of course,
Hmm.
I I think there are aspects of it that are really important. And one thing my book does, and I try to do early on, is to say, look, there are other explanations for what's going on. They're not necessarily all wrong. I am accounting for a part of this puzzle. This is a huge puzzle, and looking at, in my case, about 1,000 years of history. In Diamond's case, much more than 1,000 years of history. Monocausal explanations are not going to be correct, in the sense that there's so many things causing. However, we can kind of focus and really kind of dig deep into one aspect and kind of see what role this might have played in this. Now, Diamond. So all this is to say, I think purely geographical explanations do have some really, really significant insight. And I think Diamond's explanation is much stronger on Eurasia versus the Americas. So his argument, I think one of the more convincing parts of his argument is kind of the east-west axis of Eurasia meant that it was a lot easier to kind of trade ideas and grains, and have domesticated animals, because you had, yeah, a lot of people living within kind of a similar latitude, that were that natural barriers didn't hinder such things, whereas the Americas is very much a north south axis, and so you're not going to have contact between, say, even the Incas and Aztecs or things like that, where are certainly the natives of what is now the U.S. or Canada. So on that, I think Diamond's very good. I think his explanations are harder to square with reversals within Eurasia, which is what my book is about, of course.
Hmm.
Uh, the and it's particular reversals of almost any type. It Now, you could take Diamond's argument as a starting point and say that maybe some of the geographic explanations he points out led to maybe institutions that led to stagnation in one part but not the other, things like that. But that would also be putting words in Diamond's mouth that aren't there. Um, so again, while I think, to talk about Diamond, I think I like that book, but I think for the specific question I'm asking, it leaves more unanswered than it answers. So with Bob Allen's work, so his work's more generally on kind of relative prices. So in a sense, he and I are kind of asking different questions, because he's much more interested in industrialization. My book, in a sense, ends prior to the Industrial Revolution, and I'm trying to get at essentially why England in particular, but Northwestern Europe more generally, were in prime position to be the place that where the modern economy, industrialization, takes off by, say, 1700, if not before.
Hmm.
Um, Whereas that would have been very not obvious, 1,000 years or even 500-600 years earlier.
Hmm.
So Allen's argument is really, once you get to that point, he argues that England had high wages, so that means that the industrialists or capitalists were looking for ways to economize on labor, and were more likely thus to invent, or there was more incentive to invent labor saving technologies than there wasn't, not just in Europe, but in other parts of the world, especially, where, say, he compares, say, England and India, which, eventually, or at least certainly by industrialization, was a British colony, and labor was sufficiently cheap where it would have required an immense amount in order to make it worth it, even to invest in the type of capital that made industrialization happen. Now, with
Yep.
respect to my book, I don't necessarily I can leave my opinions on Alan's argument aside, but I don't necessarily think that they contradict each other. In that, but where my book leaves off, England has become in a pretty good shape to be that leader. They've essentially become one of the economic powerhouses, and that's essentially where Alan's argument kind of starts. In that parts of England had much higher wages than other parts of the world, and that for him is one of the key differences between England and the rest of the world. For my own sake, I think I tend to. So the broader debate right now in economic history is more between, at least in terms of the Industrial Revolution, is between Alan and Joel Moykier's thoughts. I think
Mm-hmm.
Joel Moykier is more about the kind of what he calls the culture of growth or the enlightened economy, where it's more about kind of bringing Enlightenment ideas, and there's cultural attributes within England that are contributing to growth. I tend to fall. That's a terrible explanation of his brilliance and his decades of work, but which might make it seem weird that I do tend to fall more along the lines of his explanation. But regardless, I think both of those explanations are not necessarily inconsistent or consistent with my book, in that they're if you want to make the argument, and I'll throw out a hint that I am working on another book right now with a co-author who I'll keep I'll keep in the dark for now, because we're going to announce the book not too long, but we're working on something that kind of brings all these ideas together. But for now, I think for my book, you would have to kind of put words either in my mouth or their mouths to make those connect. Now, the one you would not have to do that with is the third one you mentioned, Weber.
Mm-hmm.
The Weber's Protestant ethic hypothesis is very much contradictory to my own, because his is precisely what we mentioned not that long ago. His hypothesis is that doctrine mattered.
Yep.
Is that this especially Calvinist notion of predestination and the elect, that people were elect to go to heaven, and that was predestined, and they wanted to show that they were the elect, and thus they worked harder, and he views this as a uniquely Protestant thing. I think he got his correlations right in a sense, but his causation wrong. And all I mean by that is that after the Reformation, it is the case that the world's leading economies, first the Dutch Republic, soon, more or less soon, as the Dutch break away from Spain, they also kind of become Protestant and very quickly become the world's leading economy. Eventually, the British overtake them, and then eventually the U.S. overtakes Britain as the world's leading economy. All those are predominantly Protestant economies. And Weber was writing in Prussia, which had a mix of Protestant Catholics at the time, and he did notice that the Protestant areas of Prussia were better off than the Catholic areas. There's been a lot of research recently that that supports this notion. And my book does claim that this was not a coincidence. So maybe this is even a good segue into the kind of the second half of the book.
Yep.
But for very different reasons than Weber proposes. Weber proposes what I would call a highly Eurocentric view, a kind of cultural explanation. And it might be clear by now that I don't by any means view cultural explanations as bad. In fact, I think culture really matters. And even if you think of religion as kind of an aspect of culture, it really matters for the way people view the world, for the way politics is done, for all these types of things. But the way Weber viewed it, there's just too many holes in the story. I mean, and this has been drawn out for a long time. So it was originally Tawney in the 1920s that noted this, and then others. There's been like a cottage industry and kind of taking pot shots at the Weberian hypothesis. I guess on the other hand, if over 100 years after I write something, people are still talking about it, I wouldn't be too sad, even if to say it was wrong. But In his case, so I mean, just even the most obvious counter to this is that this capitalist spirit, which he views as inherent in Protestantism, very clearly existed prior to the Reformation. I mean, the Italian city, even within Europe, the Italian city-states are these little capitalist hubs that bring back commerce. There are spouts of capitalist ideas, throughout China, certainly, even Central Asia, into the Middle East. So to think that it's purely something to do with Protestantism, and even then, a lot of really what he's noting is much more of a Calvinist thing. Now, to be fair, the Calvinist ideas were really popular in the Netherlands and colonial America as well. But my take on this is to kind of now I think segue a little bit just briefly into the second part of my book, is that this wasn't coincidence in that my book does actually provide an explanation. It's actually consistent with the theory in my book that Protestant areas did do better, but it had nothing to do with the any type of Protestant doctrine. And to be clear, there's not even a religion of Protestantism. There's many different Protestant religions, all of which have similar doctrine, but some being very different than others. It had much more to do with the political economy of Protestant societies. And all I mean by this is what the Reformation did was it provided a death knell to the church wherever it was. And the church was this huge institutional apparatus that, even though, as I mentioned before, it was weaker at didn't legitimate rule as well as maybe the leading Muslim clerics in the Middle East, it still played a role in legitimating rule for sure. And what the Reformation did was it ended this. And the Protestant religious authorities, they weren't part of a broader institutional apparatus, even or if they were, like in the case of the Church of England, they were under the ruler's thumb. This was not a group that really had the legs to legitimate rule. And so what the book says says, well, this doesn't mean that rulers just stopped having their rule legitimated by people in society. They had to turn to someone else, in Europe at least, and specifically those parts of Europe that became Protestant. And that's where I argue that parliaments were the most obvious place to turn. They were already an organization that had been well established by the Reformation. Almost everywhere had some form of parliament in Western Europe, regardless of what they called it, some place where the leading elites got together to generally negotiate over various things with the king or queen. Generally, they were called when the crown wanted money to fight wars. But they were the obvious people to turn to. They had power in society for some reason or another. Oftentimes, they were composed in part of churchmen, but also major nobility, but also urban elites. So those engaged in economic activities. And this is where the book says then that what the thing that the Reformation was most important for in terms of economic outcomes was giving a much greater seat at the political bargaining table to the economic elite. And again, if the line of this argument is this has nothing to do with Protestantism or there being some Protestant ethic or any type of doctrine. It has to do with the dismantling of the old political economy and the rulers then having to turn to someone else. And those economic elite were an obvious people to turn to. And so what the book then does is it then lays this out, and it looks specifically at the cases of England and the Dutch Republic, where it becomes very clear that parliaments become way more important after the Reformation. And particularly, we start seeing it nearly immediately in the types of laws and policies that are put forth. So in the Dutch Republic, you get a ton of new acts that are providing public goods that encourage trade, that encourage transportation networks. Again, these are things that the economic elite are not doing out of the kindness of their own heart, but it's because they benefit themselves. But they also do benefit the economy more generally. In England, the process, there is a lot of back and forth between Parliament and the Crown. But the Tudor parliaments, those of the 16th century, are generally kind of congenial. They go back and forth, but in a more congenial way. Eventually, the Stuarts push back against Parliament. it's imploded. They fight civil war, and then the Glorious Revolution removes James II, and ultimately Parliament becomes supreme in England. And so in England, ultimately, what you get is parliamentary supremacy, which in the context of the way I'm viewing it is the supremacy of at least those with economic interests have a much larger seat at the bargaining table than they do elsewhere. And I would like to say one more thing before we move on is that I think another misconception of the book and the way I even just described it, and I do try to dispel this in the end, is that I'm also not saying that a country or a state run purely by the economic elite is going to be a good thing either. The economic elite want things because it suits their own interests. Now, oftentimes or sometimes those things benefit society as a whole, but sometimes they don't. They also want monopolies for themselves and their friends. They often will go to war for commercial privileges, things like this. But the point that the book tries to make, and one of the key points, is that the optimal amount of political bargaining power for the economic elite is not zero, though. You want them to have a seat, and probably a fairly important seat at the bargaining table, if you want the types of economic law and policies that kind of portend economic success. And it's just that because of the legitimating arrangements in the Middle East at the time, especially where religion was playing such a role, the economic elite had very little say. That's the broader takeaway, I think.
Yeah. You talk about the importance of the Reformation as this kind of milestone event in this reversal of fortunes. And one of the case studies you use in your book, you talked about usury earlier, but you also talk about the printing press in your book, and that really forms one of the key tenets of your argument, that the printing press brought about the Reformation, and that in turn brought about the kind of economic trends that you observed. Could you tell us a bit more about this relationship?
Yeah, so to kind of, I guess, back up in a sense, so I mentioned before, the usury case study, and I viewed usury as more of a case study than anything else. I think that usury laws were important for, especially for maybe the lack of banking in the Middle East, things like that. But I think more importantly, usury laws were the types of things that kind of are indicative of this broader political economy equilibrium. Now, I did the same thing with the printing press, and I briefly mentioned that earlier in the podcast, that namely that in the Middle East, in particular the Ottoman Empire, now we're talking about, you had the Ottomans more or less banned the printing press for about 250 years. And that was a direct result of the political economy equilibrium in which religious authorities had an important seat at the bargaining table. This was not the case in Europe. By 1450, the church had lost, not only had it lost its important seat at the political bargaining table, it had also lost its intellectual monopoly for a while, until about 1200 or so. Most of the intellectual work, whether it be transcribing books or even the very infrequent writing of new material, would have been done, say, in monasteries or by churchmen. But the university system that arises beginning in the 13th century begins to undermine that. And so there are these other sources of intellectual, the spread of intellectual activity as well in Europe. So the situations are very different. And what that means with respect to the printing press is that even had the church wanted to ban the printing press, and they probably should have, they couldn't have. Because the other key thing is that to note that is that the church in Europe, or say leading religious authorities in the Middle East, none of them actually have the capacity to ban anything. That requires those with the access to violence, the rulers, political leaders, to go along with what the religious authorities want. And the point in the book is just that made sense for the Ottoman rulers to do so. Religious legitimacy was very important. It did not make sense for European rulers. And so what we see is by 1500, even, the printing press is spread throughout Europe. Most major cities have printing presses in some way, shape, or form. Huge print centers are everywhere. There are a few tries here and there to slow down printing, but that's actually, it tends to not be from the church. It tends to be from the old scribes or scribal guilds, people like that whose livelihoods are threatened. But none of these succeed. The printing press is this new and transformative technology. And then the argument. So then I make the argument which has long been made, in the history of the social sciences. And again, what I did was I gathered data to actually kind of substantiate it. It's namely that where you had printing, the Reformation was more likely to succeed. So one thing that I know is it's really in a sense no coincidence that printing was invented in Mainz, Germany around 1450, and this print culture emerged in Germany. And then not that long after print really spread, so it takes about 40, 50 years for it to spread, which by the context of late medieval Europe is actually quite quick, given especially how capital intensive and how expensive printing presses were. But the printing press, or rather the Reformation, starts about 250 miles away in Wittenberg, Germany. And it's in this kind of area where you already have a big print culture. And this connection between the two has long been noted, even by Luther himself, namely that the printing press was used to spread propaganda, essentially, of the Protestants. And this is where I think you can say there was plenty of, say, demand, to use the terminology of economics, for the Reformation, or really a movement against the church. There had been plenty of demand for centuries prior to the Reformation itself, which begins in 1517. Namely, the church had become increasingly corrupt. There had been many calls for reform in the church, and really some actually quite aggressive movements. So Jan Hus in Bohemia, for example, is about 100 years prior to Luther, really threatened the church, and they burned him at the stake. The idea that I put forth, and again, I'm certainly not the first person to note this, is that a big difference between Luther's movement and the movements of other reformers, including Hus, would have been that he had the press. And what the press did is it allowed these very dangerous ideas to spread more quickly than the church could react to. So I should also note, and I have some current ongoing work on this, is that Luther himself was a pretty important person. So this kind of gets out of the narrative itself of the broader book. But Luther knew how to use the press. He wrote hundreds and hundreds of pamphlets, and what the press did that just would not have been feasible even 50 years earlier was that all these different parts of Europe, whenever Luther would write something, if you were anywhere near a printing press, it would be reprinted in those areas. So all these different parts of Europe, especially Central Europe, but even eventually into Northwestern Europe, in parts of France, would receive this kind of virulent anti-church rhetoric that really helped make this movement get enough of a footing to succeed. And that's what. So when I was mentioning the usury restrictions before, I was noting that I don't necessarily really view usury as a big reason why there was reversal of fortunes between the Middle East and Western Europe. I do think that the printing press had more direct, or rather more importance, but it was its indirect importance rather than its direct importance. It's not that literacy rates shot up or something because people can now have access to books in Europe. It was the indirect importance of the printing press that really mattered, and this indirect importance was that it facilitated massive religious change in the Reformation. And that I view as being fundamentally important, because the thing the Reformation did, as we just talked about, was that it fundamentally undermined the political economy of Europe, at least where the Reformation succeeded. Whereas you have parliaments becoming much more important, you have the economic elite becoming much more important, having a much greater say at the political bargaining table.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think, given the ubiquity of printed material in this day and age, it's really difficult for us to truly appreciate the importance of the printing press during that time. But as far as information and communication technologies were concerned, the printing press was a very major breakthrough, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, I think the obvious analogy to the modern day is the internet, in the sense that if you think the pre-internet days before the internet days, the internet is the fundamental information communication technology breakthrough of our lifetime and really probably the last 100 years, but it's probably even more fundamental than that. The printing press, in that by the time the internet had come about, we were already a connected world. We had telephones, we had telegraph, whatnot. The preprint world was really an unconnected world. It was really hard to get significant information from one place to another. And the printing press did that. And that's why, again, I've said this a few times now, that the church, had they been able to, they probably would have wanted this thing banned. An institution that is pretty unpopular is not going to want an information and communication technology out there that allows the seeds of dissent to spread. I mean, that's why even in modern day, you see uh, many regimes banning social media. Right? It's a very similar idea. That's what social media does. Is it allows thoughts to spread instantaneously, and even dissent to spread instantaneously. While of course the printing press didn't do that. Relative to the preprint world, it might as well have been instantaneous.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to your broader research interests. This book is just one in a series of publications you've authored on the role of religion in politics and in the economy. You say you're working on another right now. What is perhaps the most important thing that you think people should take away from your work about the relationship between religion and the economy?
Wow, that's a great question. So, I mean, and this really does come through, I think, in my book, and we've actually already discussed it. I mean, I think the main thing that I would like people to take away, from my book, but also from my work more generally, is that on the one hand, religion does matter for economic development, economic growth, and really, I'm obviously not the first person to say that. But I am. In fact, there's a huge literature that's blossomed in the last 10 years, mostly done by economists and political scientists, that has really shown the many different ways in which religion affects economic and political outcomes. I think the one thing that I would like to people to take away from my work, though, is that really the first order effects of religion on economic and political outcomes come through politics, come through the role that religion, or really, and we could even go a little broadly, since you asked about some of my other work as well, ideology and culture more generally, that when we're talking about decision making that can affect societies at large, that's where religion, or maybe ideology might even be a better word, because ideology can be religious, but it can also be secular, because I think that the type of stuff we're talking about could just as well be applied to, say, communist ideology, or frankly even capitalist ideology. That the way people view the world, the lens through which people view the world, certainly has an effect on their very microeconomic actions. But cumulatively, this also builds up into the institutions in the societies in which these people live, or people everywhere live, and those are the mechanisms through which what we're calling here religion, culture, ideology. Those are the mechanisms through which I think the long run impact and the long run trajectory of economies in different parts of the world is really affected by ideology. So that I think that would be the thing that I would like people to take away most from my work, because I believe this to be true, and I believe this to be true not just because it's some nilly willy belief, but because that's where my research has taken me. And this is again, as we were talking about earlier, that I've been doing this kind of very narrow topic for a long enough now where I feel like I have some authority to speak on it, and that would be the one takeaway I would like people to take.
Mm-hmm. That's very, very well said. I think we've taken up quite enough of your time today, but before we end, I'd just like to ask if you could interview anyone for their new book in history, who would that be?
So, new book being in the last 4 to 5 years.
Sure.
Yeah. So can I maybe say two people?
Of course.
So both people I've heard give interviews that I'm thinking of, and they're just fascinating people and have fascinating insights. So the first one would be somebody I did mention briefly before is Joel Mokyr,
Mhm.
who is just a polymath in many ways. His books are, especially his recent books on the Enlightened Economy, which is 2009, The Culture of Growth, 2016, are just have so much knowledge packed into them, and they're also getting at the big possibly the biggest questions in economics and certainly economic history. Why England? What happened? And why did part of this world take off? And he's done it in such a compelling way and in a new way. And for me, it's such a kind of not just a source of inspiration, but a source of admiration. He just so knowledgeable. And he's the type of person when you're around him to, if you say, man, if I could just have 1/100th of the knowledge of this guy, I'd be a very happy person. And he's also a very entertaining person. So in terms of the podcast format, that would be great. And the other person whose work I really like, and I also heard, I think last year on a podcast and just made some amazing points, is Walter Scheidel.
Mhm.
He's written 2 recent books. His most recent book, Escape from Rome, I've read recently. I'm actually teaching I'm teaching a class this semester, and we're reading 4 books, and Escape from Rome is one of them. He wrote a book a few years ago called The Great Leveler. The Great Leveler looks at various things that have various sources of that have kind of leveled inequality over time. These kind of the great horsemen, plague and disease and war, things like that. And his Escape from Rome is kind of looking at the legacy of Rome on political and economic development over a very long period of time throughout the entire world. It's really a magnificent tome. And so I heard him on a podcast that I really like called Tides of History, where he was talking about what he does in Escape from Rome is he really thinks through the counterfactuals. And this is something that economists do, I think. This is the way economists think, is we think in terms of counterfactuals. That's how we think about causality. But it's something historians often, even though I think historians often do implicit counterfactuals, are a little less inclined to think that way. And he discusses in his book, and he's discussed in the podcast before, and it's just fascinating to he kind of methodologically a fascinating thinker. Those would be my 2 announcers off the top of my head. I mean, I could think of a ton of others. A good friend of mine, Mark Koyama, recently wrote a very fascinating book with Noel Johnson called Persecution and Toleration, where they look at the role that political economy played in persecution throughout much of European history, and they have some really, really fascinating insights in that book. And it's kind of very much up my alley, and I think the book that we've discussed in this podcast complements theirs very well. So those would be a few.
Thank you for your recommendations. Well, and thank you so much for spending a good hour of your time talking to us today, Jered. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we look forward to having you on the program again.
It has been very fun. Thank you.
On that note, thank you for your time, and thank you for listening to this episode of New Books in History.